The setting sun cast long shadows across the Arizona territory, painting the desert landscape in hues of amber and gold. Mason Doyle drove the last fence post into the hardened earth, his muscles taut from a day's labor. Sweat trickled down his weathered face, catching briefly in the long scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of a war that had ended 12 years ago but still raged inside him. He paused, leaning on the mallet, letting the stillness of the approaching evening settle around him. His small ranch, 15 miles from Fort Defiance, sat at the end of the trail before Apache territory began. Just how he wanted it, far from civilization, far from memories. The distant crack of a rifle shattered the silence. Mason dropped to the ground instantly, his body responding before his mind could process the sound. The mallet fell forgotten as his hand instinctively reached for a weapon that wasn't there. His breathing quickened, his vision narrowed, and suddenly he wasn't in Arizona anymore. He was back at Gettysburg, July 1863, the air thick with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. Men screaming, his medical kit soaked red, his brother William calling his name as bullets tore through the line. "Mason, Mason, stay with me." Mason blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present. Just a hunter, he told himself. Just someone hunting before nightfall. Not artillery, not the Confederates, not Gettysburg. He pressed his palms against the rough fence post, using the physical sensation to anchor himself. 12 years since the war, and still the smallest trigger could send him spiraling back. This was why he'd come to this desolate corner of the territory, to escape not just people, but the ghosts they carried with them. Standing slowly, Mason retrieved the mallet and his canteen. The water was warm but soothing as it washed the dust from his throat. He surveyed his small kingdom, a modest cabin with a stone chimney, a barn large enough for his 2 horses and small herd of cattle, a vegetable garden struggling against the arid climate, and endless miles of nothing in every direction. Some called it lonely. Mason called it peace. As twilight deepened, he made his way to the barn to check on the animals before retiring. The horses nickered softly at his approach, familiar with his evening routine. Military discipline never left him. Wake at dawn, work until dusk, everything in its place. The structure kept the demons at bay. Mostly. He was securing the barn door when he noticed them. 3 figures standing motionless at the edge of his property, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Mason froze, hand instinctively moving to the Springfield rifle he kept slung over his shoulder whenever he was outside. Out here, visitors rarely brought good news, especially after sundown. The figures didn't approach, but they didn't retreat either. They stood at the boundary of his fence line, waiting, watching. Mason moved forward cautiously, keeping his hand near his weapon. As the distance closed, the fading light revealed 3 women. No, 2 women and a younger girl. Their clothing was ragged, their postures wary but proud. Apache, his jaw tightened. He'd heard rumors of trouble with the local tribes, though he made it a point to keep clear of both military and tribal politics. What business could they possibly have here? He stopped 20 paces away, close enough to speak, far enough to react if needed. "This is private land," he said, his voice rough from disuse. How long had it been since he'd spoken aloud? A week? More? The tallest woman stepped forward slightly. Her face was striking, with high cheekbones and eyes that held both wariness and dignity. Despite her torn dress and the dirt smudging her skin, she carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect. "You agree to take Apache wife," she said in careful English. "We come." Mason stared, momentarily speechless. Then understanding dawned as he recalled an encounter with traders passing through several weeks ago. They'd mentioned something about an Apache woman needing protection, asked if he was willing to help. He'd agreed to shelter someone in need, a simple arrangement, not uncommon in a land where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. But he hadn't agreed to marriage, and certainly not to 3 women. "There's been a mistake," he said firmly. "I agreed to help someone in trouble. I didn't agree to take a wife." The woman's expression remained unchanged, but her eyes flickered briefly to the 2 companions behind her. The middle one stood tensed, like a coiled spring ready to flee or fight. The youngest swayed slightly, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "We need safe place," the first woman continued. We stay together, not separate. Mason's eyes narrowed as he took in details he'd missed at first glance. Bruising along their collarbones, rope burns around wrists, the careful way they held themselves despite obvious pain. These weren't just travelers seeking shelter. They were running from something, or someone. Before he could respond, the youngest girl's eyes rolled back, and she crumpled to the ground. Mason moved without thinking, closing the distance in 3 long strides and dropping to one knee beside her. The middle woman hissed something in Apache and pulled a crude knife from her belt, but the eldest held up her hand, stopping her. Up close, Mason could see the girl's condition was worse than he'd thought. Her skin burned with fever, her breathing shallow and rapid. Dehydration, exhaustion, possibly infection from untreated wounds. The doctor in him, the part he tried to bury after the war, assessed her automatically. "She needs water and medicine," he said, looking up at the eldest. "How long has she been like this?" 2 days walking," the woman replied. "No water since morning." Mason made his decision then, not out of compassion or duty, but from the same instinct that had once driven him to enlist, the inability to turn away from suffering when he had the power to help. "I'll carry her," he said, gathering the girl's slight form in his arms. "Follow me." The 2 women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Then they nodded, almost in unison, and fell into step behind him as he carried their sister toward the cabin. Inside, Mason's home revealed his solitary nature. A single bed pushed against one wall, a table with one chair, shelves holding practical necessities but no decorative items. No photographs except one small, faded image in a simple frame beside the bed. 2 men in union uniforms standing side by side, one with Mason's unmistakable features, the other younger but with the same square jaw and serious eyes. He laid the girl on the bed and moved efficiently around the cabin, gathering water, clean cloths, and a wooden box he rarely opened. The 2 women hovered near the door, unwilling to fully enter this stranger's domain, but equally unwilling to leave their sister. "What's her name?" Mason asked as he dampened a cloth and placed it on the girl's forehead. "Tala," the eldest answered. "I am Kiona. This is Sitala." She gestured to the middle sister, who remained vigilant, her hand never straying far from her hidden knife. Mason nodded but didn't offer his own name in return. Names meant connections, and connections meant vulnerability. He opened the wooden box, revealing medical supplies, bandages, surgical tools, small glass bottles of medicine. His fingers hesitated over a brown bottle of morphine before selecting herbs and tinctures instead. Kiona watched him with interest. "You are medicine man?" Mason's jaw tightened. "I was a doctor, once." He didn't elaborate. As he tended to Tala, checking for wounds and mixing a simple remedy for fever, the cabin grew darker. Sitala lit the oil lamp without asking, its warm glow throwing long shadows across the wooden floor. Mason's hands moved with practiced precision despite years of disuse. Clean, examine, treat. The familiar rhythm transported him back to field hospitals and medical tents, places both terrible and sacred, where life and death balanced on the edge of his scalpel. When he finished, Tala's fever had begun to ease, her breathing more regular. She would recover with rest and care. He straightened, suddenly aware of how crowded his previously solitary space had become. 3 women, strangers, were now in his home, disrupting years of carefully constructed isolation. "She needs rest," he said, packing away his supplies. "You can stay in the barn tonight. There's clean straw and blankets. In the morning, when she's stronger, you should move on." Kiona's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "We have nowhere to go." Mason ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. This wasn't what he'd signed up for. One person needing temporary shelter was manageable. 3 women with nowhere else to go was a complication he'd spent years avoiding. "That's not my problem," he said, harsher than intended. Sitala muttered something in Apache, her tone clearly disapproving. Kiona responded sharply before turning back to Mason. "We work," she said. "Cook, clean, help with animals. Not burden." Mason looked at them. Really looked. Beyond the dirt and exhaustion, he saw strength in their postures, determination in their eyes. They weren't begging, they were offering a fair exchange. And something else bothered him, something he couldn't quite ignore. The marks on their bodies spoke of mistreatment. The fear behind their dignity spoke of pursuit. Whatever they were running from, it wouldn't stop looking just because Mason Doyle didn't want to get involved. One night, he conceded, "We'll talk in the morning." Relief softened Kiona's expression briefly before her composure returned. "Thank you." Mason nodded curtly and moved toward the door. "I'll sleep in the barn. Stay with your sister." Outside, the night air had cooled considerably, stars emerging in the vast desert sky. Mason stood on his porch for a long moment, staring up at the constellations, questioning the decision he had just made. He'd come to Arizona to be alone, to escape the responsibilities that had crushed him during the war. Yet here he was, taking on the care of three strangers, potentially involving himself in whatever trouble followed them. In the barn, he settled onto a pile of straw, his Springfield rifle within arm's reach. Sleep would be difficult tonight, as it often was. Usually when the memories became too vivid or the nightmares too real, he turned to the small, brown bottle in his medical kit. The morphine dulled everything: pain, memories, guilt. Tonight, however, he needed to remain alert. He couldn't afford the luxury of chemical oblivion, not with three unknown women in his cabin and the possibility of pursuit. Mason stared at the rough-hewn ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of his horses shifting in their stalls, the occasional cry of a night bird, the whisper of wind through the desert scrub. Sounds that usually brought comfort now seemed insufficient barriers against the encroaching world he'd tried so hard to escape. As moonlight filtered through the barn slats, casting striped shadows across the floor, Mason's eyes were drawn to the faint reflection of his own face in a hanging piece of polished metal. The scars seemed more prominent in the silvery light, a jagged line dividing his features, just as his life had been divided into before and after Gettysburg. He turned away from the reflection, but couldn't escape the memory it triggered: the Confederate shell that had exploded too close, the shrapnel that had torn through his face, the horror of waking to find himself alive while so many others, including his brother William, were dead. The guilt of surviving had driven him from Pennsylvania, from medicine, from humanity itself. Yet somehow humanity had found him anyway, in the form of three Apache women who needed more than he felt capable of giving. Morning came with the harsh clarity of desert light. Mason had slept little, his mind too crowded with unwanted thoughts. He rose with the sun, as always, splashing cold water on his face from the barrel outside the barn before heading to the cabin. He paused at the door, listening. Soft voices spoke in Apache, then fell silent. He knocked once, then entered. The scene inside startled him. His usually sparse home had been transformed. The floor had been swept, the single chair repositioned by the bed where Tala still rested. Kiona stood by the small stove, stirring something that smelled better than anything Mason had cooked for himself in years. Satala sat by the window, her posture alert, eyes scanning the horizon through the glass. They had made themselves at home with remarkable efficiency. "Good morning," Kiona said, her voice neutral but not unfriendly. Mason nodded, off balance in his own space. "How is she?" He moved to the bedside, professional interest overriding his discomfort. "Fever lower," Kiona replied. "She wake earlier, drink water." Mason checked Tala's pulse and temperature. The improvement was significant. His treatment had worked. The girl's eyes fluttered open at his touch, dark and momentarily confused before focusing on his face. She didn't flinch at the sight of his scar, as so many did. Instead, she studied him with curious intensity. "You are the one who helps," she said softly, her English more accented than her sister's, but clear enough. "I'm a doctor," Mason corrected automatically. "Was," he amended, stepping back from the bed. Tala's gaze remained steady. "The spirits guided us here. To you." Mason's mouth tightened. He had no patience for superstition. "Rest," he said curtly, turning away. Kiona offered him a plate of food, some kind of cornmeal porridge with herbs he didn't recognize. He accepted it wordlessly and sat at the table. The silence stretched as he ate, broken only by the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. It was the first time in years he'd shared a meal with anyone. The sensation was uncomfortably intimate. Finally, he set down his empty bowl and looked at Kiona. "I need to understand what's happening here." Kiona exchanged glances with Satala, who gave a small nod. She sat across from Mason, her posture straight, dignified despite her ragged appearance. "We are daughters of Chief Nalnish of the Mescalero Apache," she began. "Our people signed peace treaty with government 2 seasons ago. We live quietly, trade with white settlers sometimes." Her voice remained steady, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "6 days ago, men come when warriors hunting, led by man called Hollister, former soldier, now traitor. They attack our camp, take women and children." Mason's jaw clenched. He'd heard of such raids, though the newspapers rarely reported them, and the military often turned a blind eye. This man, Hollister, he sell Apache women to whoever pay highest price. Kiona's eyes flashed with controlled anger. "He sell me already to man in Santa Fe. Plan to sell Tala next." Satala spoke for the first time, her voice lower and harsher than her sister's. "He tried to touch Tala. Kiona stabbed him with knife. We run." Mason's stomach turned. The story wasn't unique in these territories, but hearing it from those who had lived, it made it impossible to ignore. "How did you find me?" he asked. "We hear of man with red hair who live alone near Apache land," Kiona explained. "Traders say you agreed to help Apache woman in trouble." Mason rubbed his beard, which indeed had a reddish tint. The traders had obviously spread word of his willingness to help, twisting it into something else entirely. "And Hollister? He's looking for you?" The sisters exchanged another glance. Satala's hand moved to her hidden knife. "Yes," Kiona said simply. "He not stop until he find us, or until someone stop him." The implication hung in the air. Mason stood abruptly, pacing the small confines of the cabin. This was exactly the kind of entanglement he'd come to Arizona to avoid. War, violence, choosing sides. He'd had enough of that to last several lifetimes. "I can give you supplies," he said finally. "Food, water, maybe a horse, but I can't get involved in this." Tala struggled to sit up in the bed. "Please," she said, her voice weak but determined. "We have nowhere safe." Mason looked at each sister in turn. Kiona's quiet dignity, Satala's fierce protectiveness, Tala's vulnerable hope. Then he looked away, out the window to the vast, empty landscape that had been his sanctuary. "1 week," he said finally, "until Tala is stronger. Then you need to move on." Relief softened Kiona's features. "Thank you," she said again, the simple words carrying the weight of all they didn't say. Mason nodded curtly. "There are rules. We all work. We stay vigilant. No lies between us. If trouble comes, we face it together, but I won't go looking for it." "We understand," Kiona assured him. "We help with everything." "Good." Mason retrieved his hat from its hook by the door. "I need to check the cattle." "Satella, you know how to use a rifle?" The middle sister straightened, surprised by the direct address. "Yes, father teaches. I good shot." Mason nodded, impressed despite himself. "There's a spare behind the door. Keep watch while I'm gone." As he stepped outside, the morning sun fully risen now, Mason tried to ignore the knot of anxiety in his stomach. 1 week, he told himself. 7 days, then back to solitude. He could manage that, but even as he thought it, he knew something had fundamentally changed. For better or worse, his carefully constructed isolation had been breached. And somewhere in the territory, a man named Hollister was hunting for 3 women who now sheltered under Mason Doyle's roof. The day passed in a strange new rhythm. Mason went about his usual chores, checking fences, moving cattle to fresh grazing, repairing tools, but with a heightened awareness of his surroundings. Every distant sound made him pause. Every movement on the horizon drew his attention. When he returned to the cabin for the midday meal, he found Kiona had prepared a simple stew from his meager pantry supplies. Satala had maintained her watch by the window, but had also mended a shirt he'd left hanging over a chair, her stitches neat and precise. Tala was sitting up, still pale but markedly improved, sorting herbs from a small pouch she carried. They worked with quiet efficiency, requiring no direction. It was as if they instinctively understood the value of making themselves useful. After eating, Mason brought in his medical box again to check Tala's progress. As he examined her, he noticed Satala watching his movements with narrowed eyes. "You use doctor tools well," she said, "not like soldier." Mason's hands stilled momentarily. I was a field surgeon before I became a combat officer. Why change? Satala pressed. Healer become killer? The bluntness of the question caught him off guard. Most people avoided asking about his past, deterred by his scar and taciturn manner. I couldn't save enough of them, he said finally, his voice low. Thought maybe I could protect them better with a gun than a scalpel. He didn't add the rest, that he'd failed at that too, that his brother had died under his command at Gettysburg, that the guilt had nearly destroyed him. Tala reached out, her small hand touching his arm lightly. Sometimes spirits decide who lives, who dies. Not medicine, man. Mason pulled away, uncomfortable with both the touch and the sentiment. Rest, he instructed again, closing his medical box with finality. As the afternoon wore on, Mason found himself watching the sisters when they thought he wasn't looking. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of people long accustomed to working together. Kiona clearly led, making decisions and delegating tasks with quiet authority. Satala executed whatever was needed with fierce precision, whether chopping wood or keeping watch. Tala, though still recovering, contributed by sorting and preparing herbs, singing softly to herself as she worked. They were survivors, Mason realized, not victims seeking rescue, but capable women who had escaped their captors through their own courage and were now determined to rebuild their lives. The realization shifted something in his perception. He'd initially seen them as a burden, a complication. Now he recognized them as allies in the daily struggle of frontier existence. As evening approached, Mason took Satala out behind the cabin to assess her shooting skills. He handed her his Springfield rifle, watching as she handled it with unexpected familiarity. My father was scout for Army, she explained, noticing his surprise. He teach us white man's weapons. Your father worked with the Union? Mason asked. Interest piqued. Satala nodded. During Big War, yes. He guides soldiers in Apache territory. Mason considered this new information. If their father had been a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War, it explained Kiona's good English and their familiarity with white customs. It also suggested a deeper connection to the conflict that had shaped his own life so profoundly. That's why Hollister hates us, Satala continued, sighting along the barrel at a distant rock. He was Confederate soldier. Call father traitor to Red Man. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about Hollister's current criminal activities. There was an older grievance at play, wounds from a war that had supposedly ended 12 years ago, but continued to fester in unexpected ways. Satala fired, the rock splintering on impact. Her aim was impeccable. You not need to teach me shooting, she said, a hint of pride in her voice. But I learn other things, if you show. For the first time since their arrival, Mason felt the faintest trace of a smile tug at his lips. Fair enough, he acknowledged. As twilight settled over the desert, they returned to the cabin to find Kiona had prepared another meal. The small table, usually set for one, now accommodated four. They ate in what had become a companionable silence, broken occasionally by practical questions or observations. After dinner, as Mason checked the windows and doors, a habit from his military days, Kiona approached him with a folded blanket. You take bed tonight, she said. We sleep near fire. Mason shook his head. I'm used to the floor. You three take the bed and the pallet. Kiona studied him for a moment, then nodded. Thank you. As they settled for the night, Mason positioned himself near the door, rifle within reach. The cabin felt different with four people breathing inside its walls, smaller in some ways, yet somehow less empty. He watched as Kiona tucked a blanket around Tala, murmuring something in Apache that made the younger girl smile. Satala sat cross-legged, sharpening her knife with methodical strokes, her eyes still alert despite the day's exertions. They had created their own order within his space, adapting to their circumstances with resilience that Mason grudgingly admired. His gaze drifted to the small, framed photograph beside the bed, the only personal item he'd brought from his former life. William's face looked out at him, forever young, forever questioning. What would his brother think of this situation, of the man Mason had become? The thought unsettled him. He turned away, focusing instead on the practical aspects of their arrangement. 1 week, 7 days, then back to normal. Yet even as he repeated this to himself, a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered that nothing would ever be quite normal again. Sleep came fitfully that night. Mason dozed in short intervals, waking at every unfamiliar sound. Tala's soft murmuring in her sleep, Satala shifting position, the cabin settling in the cooling night air. During one such awakening, he found Kiona sitting by the window, silhouetted against the moonlight. She turned at his movement, their eyes meeting across the darkened room. "Sorry," she whispered. "Cannot sleep." Mason sat up, running a hand through his hair. "It's fine." They remained like that for a moment, two vigilant souls keeping watch in the quiet night. Then Kiona spoke again, her voice barely audible. "Your brother?" She nodded toward the photograph. Mason tensed. No one asked about William. No one. "Yes," he said shortly, hoping to end the conversation. Kiona was silent for so long that Mason thought she had understood his reluctance. Then she said, "You look for him still, in your eyes." The simple observation struck with unexpected force. Mason looked away, uncomfortable with her perception. "He died at Gettysburg," he said finally, "under my command." "I am sorry," Kiona replied, and there was no pity in her voice, only acknowledgement of a shared understanding of loss. Mason found himself speaking before he could stop the words. "I was supposed to protect him. I failed. My father says sometimes we not choose what happens, only how we continue after." Kiona's silhouette remained still against the window. "You continue." The observation was neither praise nor condemnation, simply a statement of fact. Mason had continued, carrying his guilt and grief across a continent, building walls around himself that these three women had somehow breached. "Get some rest," he said, unable to pursue the conversation further. "Tomorrow will be long." Kiona nodded and moved back to her place near the fire. Mason remained awake for a long time afterward, her words echoing in his mind. "You continue," as if mere survival was achievement enough. The next few days established a new pattern to life at the small ranch. Mason and the sisters fell into a routine that maximized their collective skills. Kiona proved adept at organizing the household and garden, her natural leadership extending to deciding what needed attention first. Satala excelled at hunting and security, teaching Mason tracking techniques that even his military training hadn't covered. Tala, once recovered, revealed a deep knowledge of local plants and their medicinal properties, expanding Mason's own pharmaceutical arsenal. For his part, Mason found himself sharing more than he'd intended, showing them how to repair fence posts, how to tend to the horses properly, how to recognize signs of approaching storms in the desert sky. Teaching felt unfamiliar after so long alone, but not unpleasant. They spoke little of the past or the future, focusing instead on the immediate needs of survival. Yet in the spaces between tasks, during meals or evening rest, fragments of their stories emerged. Mason learned that Kiona had been trained since childhood to eventually lead their people, that Satala had once saved their father from a mountain lion, that Tala was considered a spirit talker by their tribe, able to communicate with the natural world in ways others couldn't. In turn, small pieces of Mason's life before Arizona occasionally slipped into conversation. His childhood in Pennsylvania, his medical training in Philadelphia, the brief period of idealism before the war changed everything. He never spoke of Gettysburg, of William, of the nightmares that still woke him sweating and reaching for weapons. But sometimes he caught Kiona watching him with a gaze that suggested she understood more than he said. On the fourth day, as Mason was repairing a broken wagon wheel, the sound of approaching hoofbeats brought him instantly to his feet. Satala appeared at his side moments later, rifle in hand, her posture tense. A single rider approached from the direction of Fort Defiance, moving at a steady pace. Not the rushed approach of someone bringing trouble, but not the casual visit of a friend either. Mason signaled Satala to alert her sisters while he moved to intercept the visitor. He recognized the man as Samuel Wilkes, the storekeeper from whom he occasionally purchased supplies. Wilkes was one of the few people Mason maintained any contact with, mainly because the man respected Mason's preference for minimal conversation. Today, however, Wilkes looked troubled as he reined in his horse at the edge of the property. "Doyle," he greeted with a nod. "Been a while." Mason returned the nod. "Wilkes, what brings you out this way?" The storekeeper dismounted, his movements betraying his unease. "Thought you should know, there's been talk in town, strangers asking questions about Apache women." Mason's expression remained neutral, but he felt his pulse quicken. What kind of questions? The kind that come with money attached. Wilkes glanced toward the cabin where Satala stood watchfully in the doorway. They're saying 3 Apache women escaped from legal custody, stole property, offering $500 for information. A considerable sum, enough to tempt many in the territory. Why tell me this? Mason asked, though he suspected the answer. Wilkes shifted uncomfortably. You've always dealt fair with me, Doyle, and I've seen what happens when men like that get what they're looking for. It ain't pretty. He paused. I didn't mention you, but others might remember you live out this way. Mason nodded, appreciating the warning. Thank you. Wilkes mounted his horse again, clearly eager to be away. They're staying at the fort, man named Hollister leading them. Claims he's got military backing. He hesitated. Whatever you're involved in, Doyle, be careful. These aren't men who stop at asking nicely. As the storekeeper rode away, Satala approached, her eyes following the retreating figure. He friend? She asked, suspicion evident in her tone. As much as anyone, Mason replied. He brought a warning. Hollister is in Fort Defiance, offering money for information about you 3. Satala's grip tightened on the rifle. We go inside, tell Kiona. In the cabin, the news was received with grim resignation. Kiona sat at the table, her back straight, her expression controlled. Tala paled but remained composed, her hands steady as she continued grinding herbs in a small stone mortar. How many men? Kiona asked. Wilkes didn't say exactly, enough to make an impression at the fort. They come soon, Satala predicted. We prepare. Mason looked at each sister in turn. The week he'd promised was only half over, yet circumstances were accelerating beyond his control. He had a decision to make: send them away now before Hollister tracked them here, or commit to protecting them with all the danger that entailed. The practical choice was clear. 3 Apache women weren't worth risking his life, his home, the peace he'd fought so hard to establish. Yet as he looked at them, Kiona's quiet strength, Satala's fierce loyalty, Tala's resilient spirit, Mason knew he couldn't abandon them to Hollister's pursuit. Not because of some misplaced gallantry, but because in the short time they'd been here, they had become part of something he'd forgotten existed, a community, however small. We need supplies, he said finally. I'll go to town tomorrow. Kiona's eyes met his, understanding the significance of his decision. Dangerous for you. Mason shrugged, a gesture that belied the gravity of what he was choosing. Been in worse situations. That evening, as they prepared for Mason's journey, the atmosphere in the cabin was charged with unspoken tension. Mason cleaned his Springfield methodically, checking and rechecking the mechanism. Satala sharpened not only her knife, but several others she'd found around the property. Tala packed herbs and bandages into small bundles, her face solemn. Kiona studied a crude map Mason had drawn of the surrounding area, memorizing escape routes and landmarks. They were preparing for war, Mason realized. A war he'd sworn never to fight again after Gettysburg. Yet here he was, planning strategy, assessing resources, calculating risks. All the things he'd done as an officer, all the things that had led to disaster before. As twilight deepened into night, Kiona joined him on the porch where he sat smoking his pipe, a rare indulgence he allowed himself in times of stress. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. We understand risk. Mason exhaled a stream of smoke, watching it dissipate in the cool evening air. I made my choice. What by? The directness of her question didn't surprise him anymore. Kiona never wasted words. Mason considered his answer carefully. Because I'm tired of running from fights that need fighting. It was more honest than he'd intended, revealing a truth he hadn't fully acknowledged even to himself. For 12 years, he'd been retreating from responsibility, from connection, from his own identity as someone who once believed he could make a difference. Kiona studied him in the fading light, her expression thoughtful. Then she reached into a small pouch at her waist and withdrew something that caught the last rays of sunset. A string of beads, intricately woven with what looked like animal teeth and small polished stones. Apache medicine, she said, offering it to him. Protection. Mason hesitated, then accepted the token, feeling its weight in his palm. I don't believe in such things. Not need to believe, Kiona replied, the hint of a smile softening her features. It believes for you. The unexpected response drew a short, surprised laugh from Mason. Perhaps his first genuine laugh in years. The sound felt foreign in his throat. Kiona's smile deepened briefly, then faded as she turned serious again. Be careful tomorrow. Hollister is snake, strikes when you're not watching. I'll be careful, Mason promised, tucking the beaded necklace into his shirt pocket. As darkness settled fully over the desert, they returned inside to complete their preparations for the coming day. The cabin, once a symbol of Mason's isolation, now felt like a fortress they were collectively defending. The irony wasn't lost on him. That night, as Mason tried to sleep, his mind replayed Wilkes's warning, calculating possibilities, planning contingencies. The familiar weight of responsibility pressed on him, not just for himself now, but for 3 lives that had become unexpectedly entwined with his own. Beside the bed, William's photograph seemed to watch him with new intensity. What would his brother think of this situation? Of the stand Mason was preparing to take? For the first time in years, Mason found himself hoping that whatever remained of William, whether in heaven as their mother had believed, or simply in memory, might be proud of the choice he was making now. Dawn broke clear and cold over the desert. Mason rose earlier than usual, checking and rechecking his preparations. He would ride to Fort Defiance, purchase necessary supplies, gather information about Hollister and his men, and return before nightfall. Simple objectives, but fraught with risk. As he saddled his horse, Kiona appeared with a small package of food for his journey. Satala stood at the cabin door, rifle ready, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Tala joined her, holding something in her hands. For strength, she said, offering him a small leather pouch. Herbs to keep mind clear. Mason accepted it with a nod of thanks. He'd come to respect Tala's knowledge of natural medicines, finding her remedies often as effective as the pharmaceuticals he'd trained with. I'll be back before sundown, he told them. If I'm not, don't wait. Take the second horse and head east toward the mountains. There are caves Satala knows. Kiona nodded, her face composed but her eyes revealing concern. We be ready. As Mason mounted and turned his horse toward Fort Defiance, he felt the weight of their gaze following him. It had been a long time since anyone had waited for his return, since his presence or absence had mattered to another living soul. The sensation was both burden and blessing. The ride to Fort Defiance took nearly 3 hours at a steady pace. Mason used the time to organize his thoughts, preparing for whatever he might encounter in town. He would need to be cautious, gather information without drawing attention, make his purchases quickly, and leave before Hollister or his men could take notice. As the fort came into view, Mason instinctively straightened in the saddle, his military bearing reasserting itself. Fort Defiance was a modest installation, originally built to control the local Apache population, but now serving primarily as a trading post in symbol of American presence in the territory. A small settlement had grown around it, a general store, saloon, livery stable, and a handful of rough dwellings. Mason tied his horse at the hitching post outside Wilkes's store and entered, keeping his hat low over his face. The scar tended to draw attention, something he could ill afford today. The store was mercifully empty except for Wilkes himself, who looked up in surprise. Doyle, he greeted quietly. Didn't expect to see you so soon. Need supplies, Mason replied, handing over a list he'd prepared. And information. Wilkes nodded, understanding. As he gathered the items Mason requested, he spoke in a low voice. Hollister's staying at the officers' quarters. Has 6 men with him, all armed like they're expecting trouble. Been asking all over about those Apache women. The military's supporting him. Wilkes glanced toward the door before answering. New Commander Major Reed. Word is he and Hollister go way back, served together in the war. Reed's turning a blind eye, calling it recovery of stolen property. Mason's jaw tightened. He'd seen such corruption before, men using their positions to pursue personal vendettas or profit. They've posted notices, Wilkes continued, nodding toward a paper tacked beside the door. $500 for information leading to the capture of 3 Apache women, wanted for murder and theft. Mason glanced at the notice, his stomach churning at the fabricated charges. In this territory, an accusation against Apaches was often enough for a conviction, regardless of evidence. Thanks, Mason said, paying for his supplies. Anything else I should know? They're planning to start searching outlying homesteads tomorrow, working their way outward from the fort. Wilkes hesitated. Doyle, whatever you're involved in. Better you don't know, Mason cut him off. For your sake. Wilkes nodded, accepting this. Be careful getting home. Hollister's men have been drinking at the saloon since noon. Mason thanked him again and left, loading his purchases onto his horse as quickly as possible. He needed to return to the ranch immediately, warn the sisters, prepare for the search party that would inevitably arrive. He was untying his horse when a commotion from the direction of the fort caught his attention. A group of men emerged from the officers' quarters, their loud voices carrying across the dusty street. At their center walked a tall figure in a black coat, a man whose bearings suggested military training despite his civilian clothes. Hollister. Mason turned away, pulling his hat lower, but not before getting a clear view of the man hunting the Apache sisters. Hollister was perhaps 50, with a trimmed gray beard and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in the elements. His right cheek bore a fresh scar, likely from Keona's knife, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator. Mounting quickly, Mason urged his horse toward the trail home, keeping his pace measured until he was well out of sight of the fort. Then he spurred the animal to a gallop, aware that time was now working against them. Halfway back to the ranch, a flicker of movement in the distance made Mason rein in sharply. A rider was moving parallel to his path, staying just within sight, watching him. One of Hollister's scouts, most likely, monitoring who came and went from the fort. Mason changed direction, heading south instead of east, hoping to lose the tail before turning back toward home. The maneuver would cost precious time, but leading Hollister directly to the sisters would be catastrophic. For nearly an hour, Mason executed a series of turns and false trails, using every trick he'd learned during the war to shake pursuers. Finally, confident he'd lost the scout, he turned toward home, pushing his tired horse harder than he liked. The sun was already low in the sky when Mason spotted his ranch in the distance. Relief surged through him, only to freeze into horror as he drew closer. A thin trail of smoke rose from behind his cabin, not from the chimney but from the ground itself, and beside his fence line lay a motionless figure. Mason spurred his exhausted horse forward, heart hammering against his ribs. As he drew closer, the figure on the ground became clearer. A man in trail-worn clothing, face down in the dirt. Not one of the sisters. Relief lasted only seconds before new fear took hold. Where were Keona, Satala, and Tala? He dismounted in a fluid motion, rifle ready as he approached the motionless stranger. The man was dead. A crude arrow protruded from his back, the fletching unmistakably Apache in design. Mason knelt to examine him, finding no identification, just a holstered revolver and a crumpled paper. One of the wanted notices for the three sisters. One of Hollister's scouts, then. He'd found the ranch while Mason was in town. The smoke came from a small fire near the vegetable garden, not damage to the property, but something deliberately set. A signal fire, Mason realized. Apache design again, carefully built to produce a specific pattern of smoke. Had the sisters killed this man and fled? Left a signal for Mason before escaping? Staying low, Mason approached the cabin, calling out softly, "Keona, Sitala." Silence answered him, broken only by the whisper of wind across the desert scrub. The cabin door stood half open, swaying gently in the breeze. Mason entered cautiously, rifle raised. The interior was in disarray, blankets thrown aside, the table overturned, signs of a struggle. His medical box lay open on the floor, contents scattered. Blood stained the wooden floorboards near the door. Fresh, recent. "Keona!" he called again, more urgently. A faint sound from outside drew his attention. Behind the cabin, near the small tool shed, movement. Mason circled around, every sense alert, finger hovering near the trigger of his Springfield. "It's me," he called softly. "Mason." The shed door cracked open, and Satala's face appeared, tense with wariness until she recognized him. She emerged, rifle still in hand, blood streaking her left arm. "They take Tala," she said without preamble. "Man come when we not expect. Try to take all of us. We fight." "Where's Keona?" Mason asked, scanning the area for the eldest sister. Satala gestured toward the barn. She hurt. Come. Inside the barn, Mason found Kiona lying on a pile of straw, a makeshift bandage wrapped around her thigh. She was pale but conscious, her eyes clear, despite the pain evident in her expression. You return, she said, relief briefly softening her features. Mason knelt beside her, medical instincts taking over as he examined the wound. What happened? Man come from hills, Kiona explained, wincing as Mason removed the blood-soaked cloth. Watch us long time, then attack when Satala checking fence. He grabbed Tala first. I hear scream, Satala continued, standing guard at the barn door. Run back, Seaman dragging Tala, Kiona already fighting. I shoot arrow, but more men come from other side. The wound was deep but clean, a knife slash that had cut through muscle but missed major arteries. Mason worked quickly, cleaning and rebandaging it with supplies from his saddlebag. How many men? He asked. 3, Kiona replied. We kill 1. Others take Tala, ride north. Toward the fort, Mason concluded grimly. We follow, Satala said, her voice hard with determination. Now, Mason shook his head. Kiona can't ride with this wound, and we'd be outnumbered at the fort. Hollister has at least 6 men with him, plus military backing. We not abandon Tala, Satala insisted, her hand tightening on her rifle. We won't, Mason assured her, but we need a plan. Rushing in will get us all killed and won't help Tala. Kiona reached out, gripping Mason's arm with surprising strength. Hollister not kill her yet. He want all of us. Use Tala as bait. The tactical assessment matched Mason's own thinking. Hollister would keep Tala alive to draw out her sisters, especially now that he knew roughly where they were located. First, we secure this place, Mason decided. Move inside, tend to your wounds properly. We'll plan our next steps. With Satala's help, he carried Kiona to the cabin. The damage inside wasn't as bad as it had initially appeared. Nothing that couldn't be set right with a few minutes' work. More importantly, none of his weapons or ammunition had been taken. As Mason properly cleaned and stitched Kiona's wound, he explained what he'd learned in town, about the wanted posters, about Hollister's connection to Major Reed, about the planned search of outlying homesteads. They've accelerated their timeline now, he concluded. They know you're somewhere nearby. How they find us? Satala asked, keeping watch by the window, as she had since they'd returned to the cabin. Mason considered this, recalling the rider who had followed him part of the way from the fort. My guess? They've been watching the trails, saw me heading this direction and sent scouts to investigate while I was in town. Kiona nodded, accepting this logic. What now? Mason sat back, mind racing through possibilities. Hollister expects you to come for Tala. He's prepared for that. Yeah, we still go, Satala said firmly. Yes, Mason agreed, but not as he expects. Over the next hour, as dusk deepened into night, Mason outlined his plan. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it offered their best chance of rescuing Tala while keeping all 3 of them alive. They would wait until morning. Mason would ride to Fort Defiance, supposedly to report Apache activity near his property. While there, he would gather intelligence on where Tala was being held and what forces guarded her. Satala would follow at a distance, using her tracking skills to remain undetected. Once they had the information they needed, they would determine the best time and method to extract Tala. No good, Kiona said immediately. Too dangerous for you. They already suspicious. I have legitimate reason to visit the fort, Mason countered. A dead man on my property, signs of Apache presence. They'll expect me to report it. Hollister may recognize you from town today, Kiona argued. I kept my head down and he was focused on his own business. Besides, one bearded white man looks much like another to someone who doesn't know me. The discussion continued as they ate a simple meal of beans and hardtack. Satala remained skeptical, preferring direct action, while Kiona worried about the risks to Mason, but neither offered a better alternative. As they finalized details, Mason found himself in an oddly familiar role, strategizing, assessing risks, making tactical decisions, skills he'd developed as an officer, skills he'd sworn never to use again after Gettysburg, now deployed to save a young Apache woman he'd known for less than a week. Life had strange ways of circling back on itself. When the plan was set and nothing remained but to try to rest before morning, Mason checked Kiona's wound once more. The bleeding had stopped, and there were no signs of infection, but she would need several days to heal properly. "You should be fine if you stay off it," he told her. Kiona nodded, though they both knew she had no intention of remaining behind if Tala's rescue required her presence. "Why you help us?" she asked suddenly, her dark eyes searching his face. "Risk everything for strangers?" Mason looked away, uncomfortable with the directness of both the question and Kiona's gaze. "You're not strangers anymore," he said finally. It was the truth, though not the whole truth. Something deeper drove him, perhaps redemption for past failures, perhaps a chance to finally protect those in his care instead of losing them. "Apache believes spirits guide us to where we must be," Kiona said softly, "even when path seems wrong." Mason didn't respond. He had long since stopped believing in divine guidance or cosmic purpose. The war had killed that faith, along with so many others. Yet as he prepared his bedroll near the door, positioning himself between the sisters and any potential threat from outside, Mason found himself touching the beaded necklace Kiona had given him, still in his shirt pocket. Not because he believed in its protective powers, but because it represented something he'd almost forgotten: the human connection of one person caring about another's safety. That night, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Mason's sleep was dreamless. No Gettysburg, no William, no blood-soaked battlefield, just darkness and rest. He woke at first light, alert and focused in a way he hadn't felt in years. The clarity of immediate purpose, save Tala, protect Kiona and Sitala, pushed aside the fog of old guilt and regret that had clouded his mind for so long. Sitala was already awake, checking her weapons with the methodical care of someone raised to understand that survival often depended on such details. Kiona slept fitfully, her injured leg preventing comfortable rest. Mason and Sitala shared a quick breakfast of cold biscuits and coffee, speaking little. There was nothing more to say. The plan was set, the risks understood. As Mason prepared to leave, Kiona woke, her eyes immediately clear despite her discomfort. "Remember," she said, gripping his arm. "Hollister clever like fox. Trust nothing he say." "I won't," Mason assured her. "Stay hidden. If we're not back by nightfall—" "We will return," Sitala interrupted firmly, adjusting the quiver of arrows on her back. Mason didn't argue. Better they believe in success, even if he privately calculated the odds against them. He mounted his horse while Sitala disappeared into the scrubland, her Apache skills making her nearly invisible within moments. They would travel separately, Mason openly on the trail, Sitala paralleling his route through the rough country, unseen by any watching eyes. The ride to Fort Defiance felt different than the previous day. Then, Mason had been anxious, uncertain. Now he rode with the steady determination of a man who had made his decision and accepted its consequences. If anyone had told him a week ago that he would be risking his life for 3 Apache women, inserting himself into a dangerous conflict with both criminals and military officials, he would have dismissed the idea as absurd. His entire existence had been structured around avoiding precisely such entanglements. Yet here he was, riding deliberately into danger, not out of some abstract sense of justice or heroism, but because 3 specific lives had become important to him. Kiona's quiet strength and perceptiveness, Sitala's fierce loyalty and competence, Tala's gentle resilience. They had become, in the space of a few days, the first people since William that Mason could not bear to fail. Fort Defiance appeared on the horizon, its adobe walls pale in the morning light. Mason slowed his horse to a walk, mentally reviewing his approach. He would report the dead man found on his property, express concern about Apache activity, gather whatever intelligence he could about Tala's location, and leave without arousing suspicion. Simple objectives, complex execution. As he rode through the gate, Mason noted increased activity compared to the previous day. Soldiers patrolled the walls, and civilian visitors clustered in small groups, voices hushed in conversation. News traveled fast in the territory. Word of Apache raids or attacks always drew attention. Mason dismounted at the hitching post outside the commander's office, taking a moment to scan the fort's interior. The officers' quarters where Hollister stayed, the stockade where prisoners would be held, the stables where horses were kept readied for pursuit. No sign of Hollister himself, which was both relief and concern. Where was he? With Tala, Mason adjusted his hat low over his scar and approached the office. A young corporal sat at a desk, looking up as Mason entered. "Can I help you, sir?" "I need to report an incident at my property," Mason said, keeping his voice even. "Found a dead man this morning. Signs of Apache activity nearby." The corporal straightened. "Your name and the location of your property, sir?" "Mason Doyle. My ranch is 15 miles east, near the boundary of Apache territory." Recognition flickered in the corporal's eyes. "The former surgeon? From the Pennsylvania 76th? Mason tensed. He hadn't expected to be recognized, especially not by someone too young to have served in the war. "Yes," he acknowledged cautiously. "My father served with you, sir, Corporal James Thomas. He was at Gettysburg." For a moment, Mason couldn't breathe. Thomas. The name struck like physical blow. Images flooded back. A young black soldier, badly wounded, whom Mason had operated on during the chaos of retreat. One of the few he'd managed to save that day. "I remember," he said finally. "Your father was a brave man." The young corporal, Thomas's son, smiled briefly. "He speaks highly of you, sir. Says you saved his life when others wouldn't have bothered with a colored soldier." Mason nodded, uncomfortable with both the praise and the memories it evoked. "Your father here at the fort?" "Yes, sir. Captain Thomas now. He's with the patrol that left this morning." "Captain?" Mason was genuinely surprised. It was unusual for black soldiers to rise to commissioned rank, even years after the war. "Yes, sir. He commands the Buffalo soldiers stationed here." The corporal hesitated. "Sir, about your report." "I found a dead man on my property this morning," Mason continued, refocusing. "Shot with an Apache arrow. Signs of others nearby." The corporal nodded, writing this down. "This may be connected to reports we've received. A band of renegade Apache women attacked travelers yesterday. Major Reed, he has authorized a search of the area." The official narrative, Mason realized. Hollister's version of events, sanctioned by his ally in command. "I should speak with Major Reed," Mason suggested. "He's currently occupied with the prisoner," the corporal replied, then seemed to catch himself. "That is, with questioning a suspect captured yesterday. Tala. So she was here at the fort, being questioned by Reed and Hollister." "I see," Mason said neutrally. "Where would I find him?" "The stockade, sir, but I'm afraid civilians aren't permitted there without authorization." Mason nodded, absorbing this information while appearing merely disappointed. "Understood. When will Captain Thomas's patrol return?" "By nightfall, sir. They're checking homesteads to the north." "Away from Mason's ranch." "Good. One less complication." "I'll return tomorrow then," Mason said, rising. "Please inform Major Reed that I've reported the incident." The corporal promised to do so, and Mason left, his mind working quickly through this new information. Tala was in the stockade, guarded by regular soldiers, but being interrogated by Reed and likely Hollister. Captain Thomas, son of a man Mason had treated at Gettysburg, was away with a patrol, but would return by nightfall. As Mason walked toward his horse, he scanned the fort again, paying particular attention to the stockade, a small, separate building near the western wall. 2 guards stood outside its door, rifles at the ready. Making his way to Wilkes's store to maintain his cover, Mason continued gathering details with the practiced eye of a former military officer. Number of soldiers visible? Approximately 20. Weaponry? Standard army rifles, a few sidearms, no artillery visible. Shift changes would likely occur at noon and dusk based on standard military protocol. Inside the store, Wilkes greeted him with a questioning look. "I reported the dead man," Mason explained quietly. "Didn't mention anything else." Wilkes nodded his understanding. "They brought in one of the Apache women yesterday," he murmured, arranging merchandise to appear busy. "Young one. Hollister's keeping her in the stockade. Says the others will come for her." "He's right about that," Mason replied, selecting a few items to purchase: bandages, antiseptic, ammunition. "They've doubled the guards since yesterday," Wilkes continued. "Reed's taking no chances." As they completed the transaction, Wilkes leaned closer. "Word is they're planning something tonight. Hollister was in here earlier, buying rope. Lots of it." Mason's stomach clenched. Rope had few benign uses in situations like this. "Thanks," he said, paying for his purchases. "I appreciate the information." Doyle, Wilkes called as Mason turned to leave. Whatever you're planning, be careful. Reed may wear a uniform, but he's cut from the same cloth as Hollister. Outside, Mason secured his purchases to his saddle, mind racing through possibilities. Attempting to free Tala in broad daylight would be suicide. They would need to wait until dark, when fewer eyes would be watching, and the changing of guards might create a momentary distraction. But if Hollister planned something for tonight, they might have less time than he'd thought. Mason mounted and rode out of the fort at a deliberate pace, not too fast to draw attention, but not dawdling either. Once out of sight of the walls, he turned east as if returning to his ranch, but after a mile veered into the scrubland where Satala would be watching. She appeared like a shadow from behind a rocky outcropping, silent and alert. "She's in the stockade," Mason reported without preamble. "2 guards at the door, probably more inside. Hollister and Reed are questioning her." Satala's expression hardened. "They heard her?" "I don't know," Mason admitted, "but Hollister's planning something for tonight. We can't wait." They retreated deeper into the brush to discuss options. The original plan, gathering information today, returning for Tala tomorrow, was no longer viable. They needed to act tonight before whatever Hollister had planned. "We need Kiona," Satala insisted. 3 better than 2. Mason agreed reluctantly. Despite her injury, Kiona's knowledge of both Apache tactics and white military procedures made her invaluable. And if they succeeded in freeing Tala, they would need to move quickly, possibly splitting up to confuse pursuers. They rode back to the ranch, taking a circuitous route to avoid any scouts Hollister might have stationed in the area. The sun was high overhead by the time they arrived, casting harsh shadows across the dusty yard. Kiona met them at the door, leaning on a makeshift crutch, her face tight with pain but her eyes alert. "Tala?" she asked immediately. "Live," Mason confirmed. "In the fort stockade. Hollister's planning something for tonight. We need to move quickly." Inside, as Mason redressed Kiona's wound, they developed a new plan. It was riskier than the original, with more variables and less room for error, but time constraints left them few alternatives. Mason would return to the fort at dusk, when activity typically decreased and the evening guard change occurred. He would seek out Captain Thomas, using their connection through the corporal to gain an audience. While Mason created this distraction, Satala would approach the stockade from outside the fort, using a section of wall Mason had identified as poorly guarded. Kiona, despite her injury, would position herself with a rifle on a ridge overlooking the fort, providing cover if needed. Her marksmanship, like Satala's, was exceptional. "What if this captain not help?" Kiona asked, wincing as Mason tightened a fresh bandage around her thigh. "He might not," Mason acknowledged, "but I saved his father's life. That creates an obligation, even if he doesn't agree with what we're doing." "And if he refuses?" Satala pressed. "Then I create a different kind of distraction," Mason said grimly, checking the action on his Springfield. "Either way, you'll have your chance at the stockade." The plan set, they made final preparations. Mason cleaned his weapons and gathered additional ammunition. Satala prepared rope and climbing tools for scaling the fort wall. Kiona sorted through their meager medical supplies, creating packets of herbs and bandages they might need. As the afternoon waned, an unexpected calm settled over Mason. The nervous energy of the morning had transformed into the steady focus he remembered from his days as a field surgeon and later as an officer. When every movement mattered, when lives hung in the balance, a certain clarity emerged, a stripping away of everything but the essential. "We leave in 1 hour," he announced, checking the position of the sun. "We'll approach from different directions. If anything goes wrong, we meet at the cave Satala showed me yesterday." Kiona approached him as he saddled his horse, moving awkwardly with her injured leg. "Mason," she said quietly, using his first name for the first time. "Thank you for this." He shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. We still have to succeed." "Not outcome that matters most," she replied. "Choice to try. Many would not." Mason paused in his preparations, struck by her words. The choice to try then. Wasn't that what had been missing from his life these past 12 years? The willingness to attempt something difficult, something that mattered, regardless of the outcome. Since Gettysburg, since William's death, he had chosen safety over significance, isolation over involvement. He had existed rather than lived. "We will bring Tala home," he said firmly. All of us. The conviction in his voice surprised even himself. An hour later, they set out, Kiona first riding slowly due to her injury, heading for the ridge that overlooked Fort Defiance. Satala left next, moving like a shadow through the scrubland, her Apache skills making her nearly invisible despite the open terrain. Mason departed last, taking the main trail, riding openly as a citizen with legitimate business at the fort. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. In another life, Mason might have appreciated the beauty. Now he calculated how much daylight remained, how long the shadows would grow, where darkness would provide the best cover. Fort Defiance appeared before him just as the sun touched the western mountains. The guards at the gate recognized him from earlier and waved him through with minimal questions. Inside, the fort was quieter than during his morning visit. Soldiers gathered near the mess hall for the evening meal. A few civilians conversed near the trading post. The stockade remained guarded, but Mason noticed the soldiers looked bored, their postures relaxed. Complacency. Good. Mason dismounted at the commander's office, where he'd spoken with the young corporal that morning. As he'd hoped, the son of James Thomas was still on duty. "Mr. Doyle," the corporal greeted him, "did you remember something else about the incident?" "Actually," Mason said, lowering his voice confidentially, "I'd like to speak with your father if he's returned. It's a personal matter." Interest and respect mingled in the young man's expression. "Captain Thomas returned an hour ago, sir. He's in his quarters. I can take you there." Mason nodded his thanks, following the corporal across the parade ground toward a small building near the eastern wall. As they walked, he scanned the fort methodically. No sign of Hollister or Major Reed. The sun had nearly disappeared, casting long shadows across the grounds. In the growing darkness, a skilled Apache like Satala could move almost undetected. The corporal knocked at a simple door. "Captain, visitor for you, sir." The door opened to reveal a tall black man in a cavalry uniform, captain's bars gleaming on his shoulders. Despite the years and the higher rank, Mason recognized him immediately. The same determined set of the jaw, the same intelligent eyes. James Thomas had been little more than a boy at Gettysburg. Now he was a man of authority, his bearing reflecting years of service and hard-won respect. Recognition dawned in Thomas's eyes as well. "Dr. Doyle?" he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Captain Thomas," Mason acknowledged with a nod. "Your son mentioned you were stationed here." Thomas turned to the corporal. "Thank you, Nathan. You may return to your post." When the young man had gone, Thomas ushered Mason inside his quarters, a sparse but orderly room befitting a career soldier. "I never thought I'd see you again, Doctor," Thomas said, offering Mason a seat. "Not after Gettysburg." "I prefer Mason these days," he replied. "I haven't practiced medicine in a long time." Thomas studied him thoughtfully. "Yet here you are at the edge of Apache territory. My son mentioned you have a ranch nearby." 15 miles east, Mason confirmed. "I've lived there 5 years now." "Alone?" Thomas asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Mason nodded, then decided to approach the subject directly. Time was too precious for extended pleasantries. "Captain, I need your help." Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't appear surprised. "This wouldn't have anything to do with the Apache girl in our stockade, would it?" Mason maintained a neutral expression, though inwardly he tensed. "What makes you ask that?" "Because I know a man with purpose when I see one," Thomas replied evenly. "And you have the look of someone on a mission, not a social call." He leaned forward. "Plus, I've just spent the day searching homesteads for her missing companions, on orders that strike me as questionable at best." Mason weighed his options quickly. Thomas seemed skeptical of the official narrative, but that didn't mean he would help them. Yet without his assistance, their chances of success dropped significantly. "The girl's name is Tala," Mason said finally. "She and her sisters escaped from a man named Hollister, who was holding them captive, intending to sell them." Thomas's expression darkened. "Hollister claims they murdered one of his men and stole valuable property." "He's lying," Mason said flatly. "Hollister is a traitor in human beings. He attacked their camp, kidnapped them along with others, and intended to sell them to the highest bidder." "And how do you know this?" Thomas asked, his tone careful but not dismissive. "Because her sisters told me after they sought refuge at my ranch." There it was, the admission that could condemn him. Harboring fugitives, interfering with a military operation. If Thomas chose to report him, Mason would likely find himself in the stockade alongside Tala. Instead, the captain sighed heavily. I suspected as much. Hollister's story never sat right with me, but Major Reed accepted it without question. He looked directly at Mason. What exactly are you planning, Doctor? We're taking Tala out of here, Mason said simply. Tonight. Thomas's eyebrows rose. We? Her sisters and I. That's suicide, Thomas stated. The stockade is guarded. Reed has ordered the girl kept under close watch until her companions are captured. We know, Mason replied, but we also know Hollister is planning something for tonight, something involving rope and I suspect public spectacle. Thomas's expression hardened. A hanging. Most likely. Reed wouldn't sanction that, Thomas argued, though uncertainty crept into his voice. Wouldn't he, Mason countered. From what I've gathered, he and Hollister share a history and possibly business interests. Thomas was silent for a long moment, internal conflict evident in his features. Finally, he spoke. My father told me what you did at Gettysburg, how you operated for 36 hours straight, saving men others had given up for dead, how you treated colored soldiers with the same care as white officers. Mason shook his head. I was just doing my job. No, Thomas said firmly. You were doing what was right, regardless of orders or convention. My father never forgot that. He stood, moving to the window, looking out at the fort now bathed in twilight. It seems I have a debt to repay. Mason remained silent, allowing the captain to reach his own conclusion. I can't openly oppose Reed, Thomas said finally. He's my commanding officer, regardless of my opinion of his character. But, he turned back to Mason, decision made. I can ensure my men are occupied elsewhere during an unfortunate disturbance. Relief flooded through Mason, though he kept his expression controlled. What kind of disturbance? Thomas smiled grimly. The kind that requires immediate attention from all available personnel, including those guarding the stockade. When? Mason asked. Give me 30 minutes. The supply warehouse on the north side. Thomas moved to his desk, retrieving a key from a drawer. This opens the stockade's rear entrance. The girl is in the third cell. Mason accepted the key, tucking it securely inside his coat. Thank you. Thomas's expression grew serious. After tonight, you can't stay at your ranch. Hollister and Reed won't stop looking. They'll connect you to this eventually. I know, Mason acknowledged. It was a price he had already calculated and accepted. His solitary existence, his hard-won peace, sacrifices in the balance against Tala's life and freedom. Where will you go? Thomas asked. Better you don't know, Mason replied, standing to leave, for your sake. Thomas nodded, understanding. Good luck, Doctor. He extended his hand. Mason shook it firmly. Captain? Outside, darkness had fallen completely. Lanterns illuminated the parade ground, but much of the fort remained in shadow. Perfect conditions for what they needed to do. Mason moved casually toward the stables, appearing to be a visitor preparing to depart. From there, he had a clear view of both the stockade and the northern warehouse Thomas had mentioned. 20 minutes passed, then 25. Mason checked his pocket watch anxiously. Had Thomas changed his mind? Would the distraction come at all? Then, at precisely 30 minutes, shouts erupted from the direction of the warehouse. Flames leapt into the night sky, illuminating the northern section of the fort in flickering orange light. Fire! Fire in the supply warehouse! Soldiers rushed toward the blaze. Officers barked orders. Even the guards at the stockade looked toward the commotion, one taking a few steps in that direction before remembering his post. Mason waited, counting seconds. The fire grew, consuming the wooden structure with surprising speed. Thomas had been thorough. Then, the moment Mason had been waiting for, a lieutenant ran toward the stockade guards, gesturing urgently toward the fire. After a brief exchange, both guards abandoned their post, running toward the warehouse to join the bucket line forming to combat the blaze. Now. Mason moved swiftly through the shadows, circling behind the stockade to the rear entrance Thomas had mentioned. As he reached the door, he heard a soft whistle. Sitala's signal. She had made it over the wall. She appeared beside him, silent as a shadow, bow in hand. No words were needed. Mason inserted the key, turned it carefully, and the door swung open on well-oiled hinges. Inside, the stockade was dimly lit by a single lantern. 3 cells lined the back wall, simple compartments with iron bars. In the third, as Thomas had said, a small figure huddled on a wooden bench. "Tala," Satala called softly in Apache. The girl's head snapped up, disbelief and hope flooding her features as she recognized her sister. She rushed to the bars, reaching through. "Sitala, Mason," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Mason moved to the cell door, examining the lock. It was simpler than the exterior door, a straightforward iron mechanism that yielded to Thomas's key with a loud click. The door swung open and Tala flew into her sister's arms. Satala held her tightly for a brief moment before pulling back to examine her for injuries. "They hurt you?" she demanded in English for Mason's benefit. Tala shook her head. "Questions only, many questions, about you, about Kiona." Her eyes widened. "Kiona?" "Safe," Mason assured her, "waiting for us, but we need to move, now." They retraced their steps to the rear door, Mason leading, Satala bringing up the rear with Tala between them. Outside, the commotion from the fire continued, drawing attention away from their escape. Mason led them along the shadow of the wall toward the section Satala had scaled earlier. The rope she had used still hung from the top, nearly invisible against the adobe. "You first," Mason told Tala, helping her grasp the rope. "Satala will follow. I'll meet you outside the fort." Tala hesitated. "You not come with us?" "I need to create one more distraction," Mason explained. "Go, quickly." As Tala began to climb, a shout rang out from behind them. Mason turned to see a soldier pointing in their direction, calling for others. "Go," he urged Satala. "I'll hold them off." Satala nodded once, fierce determination in her eyes. "We meet at caves," she said, then began ascending the rope behind her sister. Mason drew his revolver, firing 2 shots into the air. Not to hit anyone, but to draw attention away from the wall where the sisters were escaping. It worked. Soldiers rushed toward him rather than toward the escaping women. Mason backed away, firing again, leading his pursuers in the opposite direction from Tala and Satala. He had almost reached the main gate when a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Doyle!" Mason turned to see Hollister emerging from the officers' quarters, face contorted with rage. Behind him stood a uniformed man, Major Reed presumably, and several armed civilians. "Stop him!" Hollister bellowed. "He's helping the Apache women escape!" Mason fired another shot, forcing Hollister and his men to take cover. Then he sprinted for his horse, still tethered near the commander's office. Bullets whined past him as he mounted, spurring the animal toward the gate. The 2 guards there moved to block his path, but Mason drove his horse forward at full gallop. They dove aside at the last moment, and then he was through, racing into the darkness beyond the fort. Behind him, he heard Hollister shouting orders, the sounds of men mounting horses in pursuit. They would follow, of course. But Mason had planned for this. He rode straight east for a mile, making his trail obvious, then veered sharply north, toward the ridge where Kiona waited. If his timing was correct, Satala and Tala would already be there. The night air rushed past as he pushed his horse to its limits, the animal responding valiantly to the urgency in his commands. Stars wheeled overhead, countless and indifferent to the drama playing out beneath them. Mason felt strangely alive, more present in this moment of danger than he had been in 12 years of safety. Every sense was heightened, the pounding of hooves against packed earth, the smell of dust and sage, the weight of the revolver at his hip. The ridge loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky, and as he approached, Mason gave the owl call they had agreed upon as a signal. 3 short hoots, pause. 2 more, an answering call came from above. Relief flooded through him. They had made it. Mason dismounted at the base of the ridge, leading his horse up a narrow trail that wound between boulders. At the top, in a small clearing sheltered by rocks, he found the 3 sisters waiting, Kiona sitting with her injured leg extended, Satala standing guard with bow ready, Tala gathering their few possessions. "You came," Kiona said, relief evident in her voice. "We feared." "They're following," Mason interrupted. "We need to move now." No further explanation was necessary. Within minutes they had mounted, Tala sharing Mason's horse, Satala helping Kiona onto the second, and were moving eastward, deeper into Apache territory. Behind them, distant shouts and the glow of torches indicated Hollister's pursuit had picked up their trail. But Mason had chosen their escape route carefully. The caves Satala had shown him offered not only shelter, but multiple exits and natural defenses. If they could reach them before Hollister caught up, they might just survive the night. The horses moved as quickly as they dared in the darkness, picking their way across increasingly rugged terrain. Mason felt Tala's arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her small form pressed against his back. She trembled occasionally but made no sound of complaint. "How much further?" he asked Satala, who rode slightly ahead, her Apache eyes better adapted to navigating by starlight. 2 miles, she replied, near Dry Creek. Mason glanced back. The torches of their pursuers had fallen further behind, but were still visible, a line of flickering lights stretching across the desert like malevolent fireflies. "They follow still," Satala observed. "Hollister not give up easy." "No," Mason agreed grimly. "He won't." The next 2 miles passed in tense silence, broken only by the sound of horses' hooves and the occasional call of night creatures. The landscape grew more dramatic, weathered rock formations rising from the desert floor, ancient pinnacles carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes. Finally, Satala signaled a halt near what appeared to be a sheer cliff face. "Here," she said, dismounting, "cave entrance hidden." Mason helped Tala down, then assisted Kiona, who bit back a groan of pain as her injured leg touched the ground. The wound had held, but the long ride had clearly taken its toll. Satala led the horses to a natural enclosure formed by boulders, where they would be hidden from view, but able to graze on sparse desert grasses. Then she guided the group to what looked like a solid rock wall, but was, in fact, a narrow passage between towering stone pillars. Inside, the passage widened into a series of interconnected caves. Satala moved confidently through the darkness, leading them to a central chamber, where a small fire pit showed evidence of previous occupation. "Apache's sacred place," she explained as she gathered materials for a small smokeless fire. "Safe here." Mason helped Kiona settle against a smooth section of wall, then checked her wound in the dim light of Satala's carefully constructed fire. The stitches had held, but the area was inflamed from exertion. "You should rest," he told her. "No more riding tonight." Kiona nodded wearily, her usual stoicism undermined by exhaustion and pain. Tala immediately moved to her sister's side, producing a small pouch of herbs from her clothing, somehow preserved despite her captivity. "For pain," she explained to Mason, mixing the herbs with a little water from their canteen. "Help heal, too." As Tala tended to Kiona, Mason joined Satala at the cave entrance, where she kept watch for their pursuers. "They still come," she said quietly, nodding toward distant torchlight, moving slowly through the desert. "But not find cave easily. Many false trails." Mason nodded, calculating distances and likely approaches. "We should set watches, 2 hours each. I'll take first." Satala agreed, returning to check on her sisters while Mason positioned himself where he could observe both the cave entrance and the surrounding terrain. Alone with his thoughts, Mason reflected on the night's events. They had succeeded in rescuing Tala, but at significant cost. His ranch was now forfeit. Hollister and Reed would ensure he could never return there safely. His identity as a peaceful settler was compromised. He was, once again, a man on the wrong side of authority. And yet, sitting in this ancient cave, listening to the soft voices of the three sisters behind him, Mason felt a strange peace. For the first time since Gettysburg, he had acted decisively in defense of something that mattered. For the first time since William's death, he had protected those under his care. Whatever came next, and he harbored no illusions about the difficulties ahead, Mason knew he could face it without the crushing weight of old failures pressing down upon him. He had chosen to try, and in that choice, something long broken had begun to heal. Dawn broke over the desert in pale streaks of gold and pink, illuminating the rugged landscape surrounding the cave. Mason, taking the final watch after Satala and Kiona had each stood guard in turn, studied the terrain with a soldier's eye. No movement, no sign of pursuit. Hollister and his men had either lost their trail in the darkness or temporarily abandoned the search to regroup. Either way, it was only a temporary reprieve. Inside the cave, the three sisters slept. Kiona propped against the wall, her injured legs stretched before her. Satala curled like a cat near the cave entrance, one hand still on her bow. Tala nestled between them, her young face peaceful for the first time since her rescue. Mason watched them with a strange mixture of protectiveness and uncertainty. They had survived the night, but what came next? They couldn't return to his ranch. Hollister would be watching it, and in any case, Reed could now legally arrest Mason for interfering with military operations. The sisters couldn't return to their tribe, not while Hollister remained free to pursue his vendetta. They were, all four of them, fugitives now. Mason's gaze drifted to the small fire reduced to embers in the morning light. The flames reminded him of another fire, long ago, the campfires of the Union Army the night before Gettysburg. He and William had sat together, cleaning their weapons, speaking of home and what they would do after the war. Such innocent plans, rendered meaningless by the slaughter that followed. Movement drew his attention back to the present. Satala was awake, her dark eyes immediately alert as she assessed their situation. She rose silently, joining Mason at the cave entrance. "They gone?" she asked quietly. "For now," Mason replied, "but they'll be back. Hollister isn't the type to give up easily." Satala nodded, unsurprised. "We need new plan, cannot stay in cave forever." "No," Mason agreed, "we can't." As the others woke, they gathered around the rekindled fire to discuss their options. Kiona, though still in pain, appeared stronger after a night's rest. Tala prepared a simple breakfast from their meager supplies while they talked. "Fort's still dangerous," Kiona stated. "Reed and Hollister control soldiers there." "Not all of them," Mason countered, recalling Captain Thomas's assistance. "Thomas helped us. There may be others who question Reed's authority, especially if they knew the truth." "Truth not matter to men like Hollister," Satala said bitterly. "Only money and power." "Sometimes truth is powerful when the right people hear it," Mason replied. "If we could get evidence of what Hollister's have been doing, proof of his slave trading, his connection to Reed, we might be able to turn the authorities against them." Tala spoke up hesitantly. "When I was in Stockade, I hear Hollister talk to Reed. They argue about ledger." Mason's attention sharpened. "A record book? Of his transactions?" Tala nodded. "Reed say too dangerous to keep. Hollister say he need it to remember who pay, who owe." "Where would he keep something like that?" Mason wondered aloud. "In fort," Kiona suggested, "with Reed's protection." "No," Tala said, surprising them. "Hollister not trust Reed fully. He say book stay in safe place, his camp." Mason exchanged glances with Satala and Kiona. If Hollister maintained a separate camp, and if it contained evidence of his criminal enterprises, that could change everything. "Do you know where this camp is?" he asked Tala. She nodded slowly. "North of Fort, Hidden Valley, where he keep people." Her voice faltered. "Before selling them, a holding camp for captives." The thought sickened Mason, but it made strategic sense. Hollister wouldn't want his human merchandise too close to the fort, where sympathetic soldiers or civilians might interfere. "How many men guard it?" Satala asked. "3, maybe 4, Tala answered. "Not need many. Prisoners chained." Mason's mind worked rapidly through the implications. If they could locate this camp, find the ledger, and deliver it to the proper authorities, not Reed, but perhaps a federal marshal or an honest army officer like Thomas, they might not only stop Hollister but also secure their own safety. "It's risky," he said finally. "Hollister and most of his men are likely searching for us, but he'd leave the camp guarded. And if we're caught there, we die anyway if do nothing," Satala said bluntly. "Hollister hunt us until find us." Kiona studied Mason's face. "You have plan." It wasn't a question. In the days they'd known each other, she had become adept at reading his thoughts. Mason nodded slowly. "Yes, but you won't like it." He outlined his idea. He would approach the camp alone, posing as a potential buyer interested in Hollister's merchandise. With Hollister away searching for them, the remaining guards might be tempted by the opportunity to make a sale in their boss's absence. Once inside, Mason could locate the ledger, free any captives, and escape before Hollister returned. Silence followed his proposal. Then, predictably, Satala objected. "Too dangerous alone," she insisted. "I come with you." Mason shook his head. They'd never believe a white man accompanied by an Apache woman was there to buy slaves. "I go as slave then," she countered. "Your property. to show others what you buy. The suggestion revolted Mason, but he had to admit it might make his cover story more convincing. "And what about us?" Kiona asked, indicating herself and Tala. "Wait here?" "No," Mason decided. "Too isolated if something goes wrong. You two should position yourselves near the camp, but hidden. If we don't return by nightfall, make your way to Fort Defiance and ask for Captain Thomas. Tell him everything." Kiona's expression remained troubled, but she nodded slowly. "When we go?" "As soon as possible," Mason replied. "Tala, can you guide us to this camp?" The young woman nodded, her face solemn but determined. "Yes, half-day ride north." They spent the next hour preparing. Mason cleaned his revolver and checked his ammunition. Satala fashioned crude restraints that looked convincing but could be quickly removed. Kiona rebandaged her wound using Tala's herbs to reduce inflammation. They divided their remaining food and water, unsure when they would next find either. As they prepared to leave the cave, Mason found himself alone with Kiona for a moment. She sat adjusting her makeshift crutch, her movements careful but precise. "This plan has many ways to fail," she said without looking up. "Yes," Mason acknowledged, "but it's the best chance we have." Kiona raised her eyes to meet his. "Why you risk so much for us?" "Truth now." The directness of her question deserved honesty. Mason touched the scar on his face unconsciously, feeling its ridged texture beneath his fingers. "After Gettysburg, after William died, I lost something essential," he said slowly. "Not just my brother, but purpose, faith, the belief that what I did mattered." He paused. "These past few days, protecting you three, I've remembered what it feels like to fight for something worthwhile." Kiona listened intently, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she reached out and touched his hand briefly. "Apache believes spirits guide us to where we heal," she said. "Maybe your brother's spirit led you to us." Mason didn't share her belief in guiding spirits, but the sentiment touched him nonetheless. "Maybe," he conceded. Kiona continued, "If we succeed today, what then? Where we go?" It was a question Mason had avoided, focusing instead on immediate survival, but it deserved consideration. "I don't know," he admitted. "My ranch isn't safe anymore. Your tribe may still be watched." "We find new place," Kiona said simply. "Together." The implication hung in the air between them. Not just a temporary alliance for survival, but something more permanent, a shared future. The thought should have terrified Mason, who had spent 12 years avoiding precisely such entanglements. Instead, he found it strangely comforting. "One challenge at a time," he said finally. "Let's survive today first." They left the cave as the morning sun climbed higher, erasing the last traces of dawn from the sky. Tala led them northward, following natural formations that provided both guidance and cover. Despite her youth and recent captivity, she moved with confidence through the rugged landscape, occasionally pausing to read signs invisible to Mason's eyes. "She has gift," Kiona explained, as they rested briefly in the shade of a towering rock formation. "Tala sees what others miss. Tracks, signs, spirits." "Spirits?" Mason echoed skeptically. Kiona smiled slightly. "You have your medicine, we have ours." By midday, the terrain had changed, the flat desert giving way to rolling hills cut through with dry arroyos. Vegetation grew slightly more abundant here, desert shrubs and twisted juniper trees providing welcome cover as they approached their destination. Tala signaled a halt at the crest of a hill, pointing toward a narrow valley nestled between higher ridges. "There," she whispered, "Hollister's camp." Mason studied the site through a small spyglass he carried. The camp was well positioned, a natural basin accessible only through a single narrow entrance, with high ground surrounding it for lookouts. Several crude structures had been erected: a larger central tent, presumably Hollister's quarters, a smaller tent for his men, and what appeared to be a holding pen, a fenced enclosure with a canvas roof for minimal shelter. Through the spyglass, Mason could make out 3 figures moving about the camp: 2 white men carrying rifles, and a third darker-skinned man tending a fire. Apache most likely pressed into service. "No prisoners in pen," Satala observed, her keen eyes narrowing. "Empty now." "Good," Mason replied. "Fewer complications." Though he had been prepared to free captives if necessary, their absence simplified matters. They retreated, to discuss their approach. The plan remained essentially the same. Mason and Satala would enter the camp openly, with Satala posing as Mason's property. Kiona and Tala would position themselves on the ridge overlooking the camp, providing cover if needed. "The ledger will most likely be in Hollister's tent," Mason explained. "Once inside, I'll need to search for it while keeping the guards distracted." "How long we wait before follow?" Kiona asked. "If we're not out by sundown, assume something went wrong," Mason instructed. "Don't attempt a rescue. Make your way to Captain Thomas as planned." Satala frowned. "I not leave you behind." "If we're captured, the ledger becomes even more important," Mason insisted. "It's the only thing that might save us all." They separated with reluctance, Kiona and Tala heading for the high ridge, while Mason and Satala prepared to approach the camp directly. Satala allowed Mason to place the fake restraints around her wrists, her expression stoic, but her eyes burning with barely contained anger at the role she had to play. "Remember," Mason told her quietly, "these men are used to seeing Apaches as property, not people. They'll ignore you, speak freely in front of you. Listen for anything useful." Satala nodded. "I hear all. Remember all." They approached the camp at a casual pace, Mason leading his horse with Satala walking behind, head bowed in apparent submission. As they neared the entrance to the valley, one of the armed men stepped forward, rifle raised. "That's far enough," he called. "State your business." Mason raised his hand slightly to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. "Looking for Hollister," he replied. "Heard he might have merchandise for sale." The guard studied them suspiciously. "Hollister ain't here. Who sent you?" "Man named Wilkes, from the trading post at Fort Defiance," Mason lied smoothly. "Said Hollister might have what I'm looking for." He nodded towards Satala. "Need a companion for this one. Getting older, needs help around my place." The guard's suspicion didn't fade entirely, but greed flickered in his eyes. "Hollister don't like us doing business when he's away." "Shame," Mason said, turning as if to leave. "I've got cash. Was hoping to conclude matters quickly." But if he prefers to wait, the mention of cash had the desired effect. The guard glanced at his companion, who had moved closer to listen to the exchange. A silent communication passed between them. "Might be we can help you," the first guard said, finally. "Hollister's due back tomorrow, but no reason we can't show you what's available." Mason allowed himself to appear pleased but not eager. "Appreciated. Hot ride out here." The guards led them into the camp, indicating that Mason should tie his horse near their own mounts. The third man, indeed an Apache, as Mason had suspected, watched them warily from beside the cooking fire. "Coffee?" the second guard offered, gesturing toward the pot on the fire. "Might be a while before the boss returns." "Thanks," Mason accepted, using the opportunity to survey the camp more thoroughly. The central tent was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with a small table and chairs set up outside its entrance. Maps and papers were spread across the table, weighted against the desert breeze with stones and a bottle of whiskey. The holding pen was empty, as they had observed, but showed recent use: disturbed earth, discarded restraints. Most importantly, no one seemed concerned about Satala, who stood with downcast eyes behind Mason, playing her role perfectly. "You just missed a shipment," the first guard commented, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "Hollister took most of the merchandise to buyers up north last week." "Unfortunate timing," Mason remarked. "What about the Apache women I heard about? The ones that escaped?" The guards exchanged glances. "You heard about that, huh?" the second one said. "Boss is out looking for them now. Worth a lot, those three, especially the youngest." Mason forced himself to nod as if considering a business opportunity, though his stomach turned at the casual way they discussed human beings. "Hollister keep records?" he asked, sipping the bitter coffee. "Of what's coming in, prices, that sort of thing?" The first guard shrugged. "Boss keeps a book. Don't let us touch it." "Smart," Mason commented. "Man needs to protect his business interests." The conversation continued in this vein, Mason carefully building rapport while gathering information. The guards, Gibson and Farley, proved talkative once they believed Mason was a potential business associate. They confirmed that Hollister maintained a ledger of his transactions, that Reed at the fort provided protection in exchange for a percentage of profits, and that they expected a new shipment within the week. As the afternoon wore on, Mason guided the conversation toward a tour of the camp. Might as well see how Hollister runs things while I'm here, considering a similar operation myself further west. Gibson, the more senior of the two, seemed pleased to show off their setup. He led Mason around the camp, explaining the holding pen's design, the watch rotation, the escape prevention measures. Satala followed silently, her presence all but forgotten by the guards. When they reached Hollister's tent, Mason paused. Mind if I take a look? Always curious how other men organize their operations. Gibson hesitated. Boss don't like people in his tent. Understandable, Mason said smoothly. Man values his privacy. Still, if I'm going to wait for him, might as well get comfortable. He nodded toward the whiskey bottle on the table. Share a drink? The bribe worked. Gibson grinned. Suppose a drink wouldn't hurt. Farley, keep an eye out. Boss could return any time. Inside Hollister's tent, Mason scanned quickly for the ledger while maintaining casual conversation. The space was surprisingly orderly. A cot, a trunk, a small writing desk, and a lockbox secured to the ground with iron stakes. The ledger would be in either the desk or the lockbox, Mason guessed. As Gibson poured whiskey into cups, Mason maneuvered closer to the desk, casually glancing at its surface. Papers, maps, a half-written letter. No ledger visible. Impressive operation, he commented, accepting a cup of whiskey, but only pretending to drink. How long has Hollister been in business? Since after the war, Gibson replied, loosened by the alcohol and false camaraderie. Was a colonel in the Confederate cavalry, lost everything when they surrendered, started trading whatever he could get his hands on, found out people were the most profitable commodity. Mason nodded, moving subtly toward the lockbox while appearing to examine a map on the wall. Smart man. War creates opportunities for those who recognize them. Gibson drained his cup, reaching for the bottle to refill it. That's what the boss always says. Chaos means profit if you're on the right side of the transaction. As the guard poured himself another generous portion, Mason quickly assessed the lockbox. Heavy iron, secured with a padlock. No chance of opening it without the key, which Hollister likely kept on his person. Changing tactics, Mason returned to the desk, casually shuffling through the papers as if merely curious. Reed at the fort. He's been cooperative long? Year or so, Gibson answered, alcohol making him careless with information. Boss has something on him from the war. Desertion, I think. Maybe worse. Beneath a stack of correspondence, Mason's fingers touched leather, a bound book, approximately the size of a ledger. Careful to maintain conversation, he shifted the papers to reveal his find. The best partnerships are built on mutual self-interest, Mason observed, as if philosophizing. Or mutual vulnerability. That's God's truth, Gibson agreed, raising his cup in salute. The book was indeed Hollister's ledger. Mason glimpsed columns of names, dates, amounts, evidence of human trafficking, corruption, perhaps murder. Exactly what they needed. But how to take it without alerting Gibson? The answer came from an unexpected quarter. Outside the tent, Satala suddenly cried out in Apache, a sound of alarm and warning. Gibson jerked upright, spilling whiskey. What the hell was that? He demanded. Before Mason could respond, Farley's voice called from outside. Rider's coming. Looks like the boss. Gibson cursed, moving toward the tent entrance. He ain't gonna like finding you here. The moment the guard's back was turned, Mason slipped on the ledger inside his coat. Better get out there. Explain the situation, he suggested calmly, though his heart raced. Outside, Satala stood where they had left her, but her posture had changed subtly, alert, ready. Her eyes met Mason's for a fraction of a second, conveying a silent message. No riders. A distraction. Where? Gibson demanded, scanning the horizon. Farley pointed north. Thought I saw dust. Could have been the wind. Mason seized the opportunity. Wind plays tricks out here. Still, if Hollister's returning, I should prepare to meet him properly. He turned to Gibson. Thanks for the tour and the drink. I'll wait by my horse. The guards, momentarily confused by the false alarm, allowed Mason and Satala to move toward their tethered mount. As they reached the horse, Mason whispered, Well done. Let's move slowly. No sudden. A shout from the tent interrupted him. Gibson had returned inside, perhaps to replace the whiskey bottle, and discovered the ledger's absence. The book's gone. Check him. Everything happened at once. Farley raised his rifle. The Apache man by the fire ducked for cover. Satala, in a single fluid motion, slipped free of her false restraints and drew a knife from her boot. Mason shoved her toward the horse. "Go," he commanded, drawing his revolver to provide covering fire. Satala hesitated only a second before mounting. Mason fired 2 shots toward the guards, not aiming to hit, but to force them to take cover. It bought just enough time for him to swing up behind Satala. They galloped toward the valley entrance, bullets whizzing past them. Mason felt a sharp burn across his arm as one round grazed him, but adrenaline kept him focused on escape. As they emerged from the valley, a rifle shot cracked from the ridge above, Kiona providing covering fire as planned. The guards, suddenly under attack from multiple directions, retreated to the protection of the camp. Mason and Satala rode hard for the meeting point they had established with Kiona and Tala. Within minutes, all 4 were reunited, quickly sharing information as they prepared to flee the area. "Hollister not really coming?" Kiona asked, already mounted on the second horse with Tala behind her. "Satala's distraction," Mason explained, pressing a bandana against his bleeding arm. "Bought us the time we needed." "You have book?" Satala asked, eyes fixed on the bulge in Mason's coat. He nodded, patting the ledger. "Names, dates, transactions, everything we need to destroy Hollister and Reed." Relief flashed across all 3 sisters' faces, but it was short-lived. "They follow soon," Kiona warned. "Where we go now?" Mason had been considering this question since they formulated the plan. With the ledger in their possession, they needed to reach someone with the authority to act on its information, someone not under Reed's influence. "Fort Defiance is closest," he said, "but Reed controls it. We need to find Thomas." "How?" Tala asked. "Fort dangerous for us." "We don't go in," Mason decided. "We send a message. Thomas said his patrol duties taking him outside the fort. If we can intercept him—" "I know where patrols go," Satala offered. "Father showed us when he was scout." A plan quickly formed. They would head toward one of the common patrol routes, find a defensible position nearby, and attempt to make contact with Captain Thomas when his unit passed. It was risky, other patrols might find them first, but with the ledger as leverage, they had a fighting chance. They rode southeast, away from Hollister's camp, pushing their horses as hard as they dared in the afternoon heat. Mason's arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but the wound was superficial, painful but not debilitating. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they reached a rocky area Satala identified as near a regular patrol route. Natural formations provided cover and multiple escape routes if needed. They made camp in a sheltered hollow, conserving their remaining water and tending to injuries. Tala examined Mason's arm, cleaning the graze and applying a poultice of herbs from her seemingly inexhaustible supply. "Not bad," she pronounced. "Heal clean." "Thank you," Mason said, watching as she wrapped a strip of cloth around the wound. "And thank you for the distraction earlier. Quick thinking." Tala smiled shyly. "I learned from sisters. Always watch, listen, ready." While Satala scouted the area and Kiona rested her injured leg, Mason examined Hollister's ledger more thoroughly. What he found sickened him. Columns of names, men, women, children, with prices beside them. Buyers' names, many prominent in territorial politics or business. Payments to officials, including Reed, for security services. Detailed plans for future raids on Apache settlements. Most damning of all, a separate section documented what Hollister called eliminations, potential threats he had personally handled. The entries were methodical, listing names, dates, and details that revealed a disturbing pride in these acts. Among them, Mason found a name that made his blood run cold. Lieutenant William Doyle, Pennsylvania 76th. William, his brother. Mason stared at the entry, disbelieving. According to the date and location, William had encountered Hollister during reconnaissance near the Confederate lines, shortly before Gettysburg. The entry, written with chilling detachment, explained that William had witnessed Hollister deserting his post, taking supplies to sell on the black market. Elimination necessary to protect profitable supply operation, Hollister had written. Shot from cover, body reported as casualty of enemy fire. The clinical precision of the notes suggested Hollister kept these records not just for memory, but as a kind of trophy collection. A ledger of problems solved, threats neutralized, and the cleverness with which he had covered his tracks. The official report had listed William as killed by enemy fire during scouting. But this changed everything. Mason had carried the guilt of his brother's death for 12 years, believing he had sent William into danger. Now he learned that his brother had been murdered, not by enemy soldiers following orders, but by a criminal protecting his illegal activities. Mason? Kiona's voice broke through his stunned silence. She had moved beside him without his noticing, concern evident in her expression. What wrong? He showed her the entry, explaining its significance with a voice that sounded distant to his own ears. Kiona listened without interrupting, her hand coming to rest lightly on his arm when he finished. Now you know truth, she said simply. Your brother died with honor. Not your fault. No, Mason agreed, a strange lightness beginning to replace the crushing weight he had carried for so long. Not my fault. The revelation transformed something fundamental in Mason's understanding of his past. The guilt that had driven him to isolation, that had haunted his dreams and poisoned his waking hours, had been based on a lie. William hadn't died because Mason failed to protect him. He had died because he discovered a crime and stood ready to report it. In that moment, Mason's purpose crystallized with new clarity. Bringing Hollister to justice wasn't just about protecting the sisters anymore. It was about honoring William's memory, completing what his brother had started 12 years before. Satala returned from scouting as dusk deepened into night. Patrol coming, she reported. 6 riders, moving slow. Thomas? Mason asked. Cannot see yet, she replied. Too far. They prepared quickly. If it was indeed Thomas's patrol, they would need to make contact without alarming the soldiers. If it was another unit, particularly one loyal to Reed, they would need to remain hidden. Mason positioned himself on a low ridge where he could observe the approaching riders while remaining concealed. As they drew closer, the fading light made identification difficult, but their formation and pace suggested a routine patrol rather than a search party. When they were within half a mile, Mason finally caught a glimpse of the lead rider's profile against the sunset. Thomas. It's him, he told the sisters, relief evident in his voice. Now we need to get his attention without startling his men. They decided on a simple approach. Mason would step into view alone, hands visible, while the sisters remained hidden but ready. If Thomas recognized him and was willing to talk, they would proceed. If not, they would retreat into the rocks where pursuit would be difficult. As the patrol approached within 100 yards, Mason moved out from his concealment, standing tall on the ridge. Captain Thomas, he called, his voice carrying in the still evening air. The patrol halted immediately, rifles lifting toward the unexpected voice. Thomas raised a hand, signaling his men to hold their fire as he peered toward the ridge. Identify yourself, he commanded. Mason Doyle, Mason replied. We need to talk, Captain. Alone. Recognition and surprise crossed Thomas's face, visible even at this distance. He conferred briefly with his men before dismounting. Stay here, he ordered them. I know this man. Thomas approached cautiously, one hand resting on his sidearm. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he stopped. Doyle, you're either very brave or very foolish to approach a military patrol after last night. Probably both, Mason acknowledged, but I have something you need to see. The girl? Thomas asked, scanning the area with practiced eyes. Safe, Mason assured him, along with her sisters, but that's not what I meant. He reached slowly into his coat, removing Hollister's ledger. This is Hollister's record of his operation. Names, dates, transactions, evidence of trafficking, corruption, murder, including Major Reed's involvement. Thomas's expression hardened. That's a serious accusation against a commanding officer. It's all here, Mason said, holding out the book, in Hollister's own hand. Thomas hesitated, then stepped forward to take the ledger. He opened it, scanning several pages by the fading light. His face grew increasingly grim as he read. Where did you get this? He asked finally. Hollister's camp, north of the fort. We found it today. Thomas closed the book, his decision visibly forming. You realize I could arrest you right now. You interfered with military operations, aided in the escape of a prisoner. You could, Mason agreed calmly, but you won't. Why not? Because you're a good man, Captain, like your father, and good men don't serve injustice when they can help it. Thomas studied him for a long moment, weighing options and consequences. Then he nodded once, decision made. My patrol returns to the fort in an hour. I'll take this to the territorial marshal who arrived yesterday, a federal official, not under Reed's influence. With this evidence, he can issue warrants for both Hollister and Reed. He paused. But you and the Apache women need to be present to testify. That puts them at risk, Mason objected. They'll be under federal protection, Thomas assured him. Reed won't be able to touch them once the marshal takes charge. And their testimony, combined with this ledger, will ensure Hollister never trades another human being. Mason considered the proposal. It was risky, but Thomas was right. Without their testimony, the ledger alone might not be enough, especially against men as connected as Reed and Hollister. I need to discuss it with them, he said finally. Thomas nodded. I'll wait. Mason returned to where the sisters had been watching and listening. He explained Thomas's proposal, outlining both the risks and the potential for a permanent resolution to their situation. We trust this captain? Satella asked, naturally suspicious. Yes, Mason said without hesitation. He helped us rescue Tala, and his father and I have a history. He won't betray us. Kiona, who had been listening intently, spoke for all of them. We go. End this now. The decision made, they emerged from hiding to join Mason. Thomas, to his credit, showed no surprise at the appearance of all three Apache sisters. He greeted them with respect, explaining his plan again for their benefit. You'll ride with us to the fort, he concluded. I'll take you directly to Marshal Harris. You'll be safe under his authority. And so it was arranged. Thomas explained to his men that he had encountered witnesses with evidence pertaining to recent criminal activity. No one questioned his orders, though several cast curious glances at the Apache women riding in their midst. As they approached Fort Defiance under the cover of darkness, Thomas directed them to a side entrance normally used only by military personnel. The risk of being seen was minimal at this hour, but they moved quickly and quietly nonetheless. The marshal's temporary office was in a small building adjacent to the commander's quarters. Thomas ushered them inside, where they found a weathered man in his 50s studying papers at a desk. Marshal Harris looked up, surprise registering at the unusual group entering his office. Captain Thomas, he acknowledged. This is unexpected. Marshal, this is Dr. Mason Doyle and 3 witnesses with evidence regarding criminal activities in the territory, including human trafficking and corruption involving military personnel. Harris's eyebrows rose, but he gestured for them to sit. I'm listening. Over the next hour, they presented their case, the ledger, their testimonies, the connection between Hollister and Reed. Harris listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or examining specific entries in the ledger. When they finished, he sat back, expression grave. This is the most comprehensive evidence of organized criminal activity I've seen in the territory. If verified, it justifies immediate action. It's all true, Mason assured him. Every word. Harris nodded. I believe you, Doyle. The question now is how to proceed. Major Reed has significant authority here, and Hollister has connections throughout the territory. Reed doesn't know we have the ledger, Thomas pointed out, or that we've connected him to Hollister's operation. A tactical advantage, Harris agreed. We should act before that changes. He turned to Mason and the sisters. I'll need formal statements from each of you. Then I'll issue warrants for Hollister, Reed, and their known associates. And after? Kiona asked, the question that had hung unspoken between them all. Harris considered her thoughtfully. Justice works slowly, even with solid evidence. There will be a trial eventually. You'll need to testify. They'll need protection until then, Mason said. Hollister won't stop hunting them just because he's facing charges. Agreed, Harris replied. I can arrange federal protection, relocation if necessary. And the process that followed was exhaustive. Each of them provided detailed statements, signed and witnessed according to legal requirements. Harris drafted warrants for Hollister, Reed, and 7 others named in the ledger as active participants in the trafficking operation. Dawn was breaking by the time they finished. Thomas, who had remained throughout, reported that Reed was scheduled to lead a morning inspection, the perfect opportunity to serve the warrant and take him into custody before he could be warned. Hollister is still searching the desert for you 3, Thomas told the sisters. We'll send a detachment to his camp to arrest him there. He won't surrender easily, Mason warned. Neither would I, facing these charges, Harris remarked grimly. But he'll have little choice. As they prepared to put the plan into action, Mason found himself standing beside Kiona near the office window. Outside, Fort Defiance was coming awake, soldiers emerging from barracks, morning routines beginning. Soon that routine would be dramatically disrupted. What happens after? Kiona asked quietly, echoing her earlier question. For us? The us wasn't lost on Mason. Not just the three sisters, but the four of them, the unlikely family they had become in the space of a week. I don't know, he admitted. My ranch isn't safe anymore. Your tribe may still be at risk from others like Hollister. Kiona nodded, accepting this uncertainty. We find new place, she said as she had before, together. This time Mason didn't deflect or qualify. Yes, he agreed simply, together. The arrest of Major Reed occurred with surprising efficiency. Confronted with the evidence and the marshal's authority, he surrendered without resistance, though his face contorted with rage when he saw Mason and the Apache sisters among his accusers. Hollister proved more difficult. The detachment sent to his camp returned, reporting a firefight had ensued. Hollister was wounded but captured alive. Two of his men, including Gibson, were dead. The third guard and the Apache servant had surrendered. By midday, both Reed and Hollister were secured in the fort's stockade, the same cells where Tala had been held just days before. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Marshal Harris called them to his office that afternoon. Reed is talking, he informed them, trying to save himself by providing details on Hollister's operation. It strengthens our case considerably. And Hollister? Mason asked. Defiant, Harris replied. But with the ledger, Reed's testimony, and your statements, his fate is sealed. He'll hang for his crimes. The pronouncement should have brought satisfaction. Instead, Mason felt only a weary relief that the immediate danger had passed. Vengeance, he had learned long ago, provided little comfort. What now, he asked, the question that had dominated his thoughts since their return to the fort. I've arranged temporary quarters for you here at the fort, Harris explained. You'll be under military protection until the preliminary hearing, which I've scheduled for the day after tomorrow. After that, we'll discuss more permanent arrangements. The reality of their situation was beginning to settle in. The danger from Hollister and Reed might be contained, but their lives had been irrevocably altered. Mason couldn't return to his solitary existence on the ranch. The sisters couldn't simply rejoin their tribe as if nothing had happened. They were, in a very real sense, between worlds now. That evening, as they gathered in the small quarters assigned to them, the weight of recent events finally descended. Exhaustion, physical, mental, emotional, claimed them all. Tala fell asleep almost immediately, curled on a narrow cot. Satala maintained watch by the window, though her vigilance was tempered by the knowledge that they were, for now, under protection. Mason found himself sitting outside on a small bench, watching the stars emerge in the desert sky. The same stars he had observed from his ranch porch for 5 years, yet somehow different now. Or perhaps it was he who had changed. Kiona joined him, moving more easily now that her wound had received proper medical attention. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. I found something in the ledger, Mason said finally. Something I never expected. He told her about William, about Hollister's role in his brother's death. As he spoke, the last pieces of a puzzle that had tormented him for 12 years fell into place. Now I understand why I was drawn into this, he concluded, why I couldn't walk away from you three, even when every instinct for self-preservation told me to. Kiona listened intently, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. Your brother's spirit, she said simply, completing his journey through you. Mason didn't dismiss the idea as he once might have. After all they had experienced, he found his certainty about many things had softened, leaving room for possibilities he would previously have rejected. Maybe, he acknowledged, or maybe just the better part of myself, finally awakened after a long sleep. Kiona smiled slightly. Same thing, different words. They lapsed into silence again, but it was a different quality of silence than before. Expectant rather than resigned, forward-looking rather than weighted with the past. Harris asked about our plans after the hearing, Mason said eventually. I didn't have an answer. What you want? Kiona asked directly. The question deserved honest consideration. What did he want? For 12 years, Mason had wanted nothing but to be left alone, to exist in a space where memory and guilt couldn't reach him. Now, with that guilt lifted, with the truth of William's death revealed, those old desires seemed hollow. I want to stop running from life, he said finally, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. I want to build something worthwhile. Kiona studied him, the firelight catching the fine lines around her eyes, evidence of years spent squinting against desert sun and weathering life's hardships. There was wisdom in that face and strength, and something else he hadn't allowed himself to recognize until now. With us? She asked, the question carrying weight beyond its simple words. Mason felt a moment of the old fear, the instinct to retreat, to protect himself from the vulnerability of connection. But that fear no longer commanded him. These past days had taught him that walls meant to keep pain out also kept life at bay. The directness of her question brought a smile to Mason's lips. Yes, he said simply. With you, all of you. The admission felt like stepping from shadow into sunlight, disorienting but warm. Good, Kiona said, satisfaction evident in her voice. We begin new story together. The preliminary hearing 2 days later was a formality. The evidence against Reed and Hollister was overwhelming. The territorial judge ordered them held for trial, denied bail, and commended Mason and the three sisters for their courage in bringing the criminals to justice. After the hearing, Marshal Harris met with them to discuss their future. The trial won't be for several months, he explained. Until then, you remain under federal protection, but that doesn't mean you have to stay at the fort. What are our options? Mason asked. Harris spread a map on the table before them. There's land available for settlement here near the southern mountains. Good water, defensible position. Far enough from established routes to offer privacy, close enough to civilization for necessary contact. He looked up at them. It could be a new start. Mason examined the location. It was indeed well positioned, similar in some ways to his original ranch, but with distinct advantages. More importantly, it represented possibility rather than escape. A place to build, not merely a place to hide. What do you think? He asked, turning to Kiona, Satala, and Tala. They studied the map together, speaking briefly in Apache among themselves. Then Kiona answered for all of them. Good land, we make it home. The decision made, arrangements proceeded quickly. Captain Thomas provided a military escort for their journey to the new land. Marshal Harris expedited the necessary paperwork, granting Mason legal title to the property with provisions for the sisters as co-residents. An unusual arrangement, but one Harris was willing to approve given the circumstances. 2 weeks after the arrests of Reed and Hollister, they departed Fort Defiance. With each day's travel, the harsh desert terrain transformed around them, first into rolling foothills dotted with juniper, then into pine-scented highlands where clear streams cut through meadows of wild grass. The land itself seemed to welcome them, shedding its harshness as they journeyed toward their future. When they finally crested a ridge and looked down upon the valley that would be theirs, even Mason, not given to sentimentality, felt a surge of emotion. It was perfect, a natural basin cradled between protective mountains, with a clear stream running through its center. Ancient pines provided both shelter and building material. Meadows offered grazing for livestock. What do you think? Kiona asked, riding beside him as they surveyed their new domain. I think William would approve, Mason said quietly. They made camp that first night beside the stream, planning the placement of buildings, discussing how they would combine Mason's ranching knowledge with the sisters' Apache wisdom to create a sustainable home. The military escort would remain for several days, helping with initial construction before returning to the fort. As darkness fell, they sat around a campfire, the sense of new beginning palpable among them. Thomas, who had led the escort personally, joined them briefly. You've chosen well, he commented, looking around the valley. Defensible, fertile, beautiful. Join us? Mason invited, offering him coffee. Thomas accepted, sitting beside Mason while the sisters prepared the evening meal. My father would be proud to see this, he said quietly. You building a new life, honoring what he always believed about you. What was that? Mason asked. That you were a healer at heart, that the war hadn't changed that, just buried it for a while. Thomas smiled slightly. Seems he was right. The observation resonated with Mason. A healer. Yes, that felt true in a way it hadn't for many years. Not just in the medical sense, though he had begun to consider practicing again in some capacity, but in a broader meaning, healing the breach between his past and present, between isolation and connection, perhaps even in some small way between the cultures that had collided so violently in this territory. As Thomas departed to check on his men, Kiona approached, sitting beside Mason in the captain's vacated place. "Good man," she observed. "Like you." Mason acknowledged this with a nod. "His father saved my life at Gettysburg. Now the son has helped save all of ours." "Circles," Kiona said thoughtfully. "Life moves in circles." The image struck Mason as appropriate. For 12 years, he had been trapped in a circle of guilt and regret, traveling the same emotional terrain without progress. Now that circle had opened into a spiral, moving forward while still connected to the past. "What will you call this place?" Kiona asked, gesturing to the valley around them. Mason hadn't considered naming the property. His previous ranch had simply been the Doyle place, to the few who knew of it. But this was different. This was a shared creation, a new beginning that deserved recognition. "What would you call it?" he asked in return. Kiona considered, looking around at the valley bathed in moonlight. "In our language, we would say, Se'ahi," she replied, "place where healing waters flow." "Healing waters," Mason repeated, liking the sound and significance. "Yes, that's perfect." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, the campfire casting its warm glow over their small circle, Mason felt a sense of peace he had thought forever lost after Gettysburg. Not the empty quiet of isolation he had sought for so long, but something richer. The peace that comes from purpose, from connection, from belonging. The war had taken his brother, his profession, and for many years his hope. But sitting here beside this remarkable woman, with her equally remarkable sisters nearby, with the promise of a new life stretching before them, Mason understood that some boundaries were meant to be crossed. The boundaries of fear, of isolation, of the past itself. In crossing those boundaries, he had found not just survival, but the courage to truly live again.